Good evening. My name is Elizabeth Romero, and I serve as the Assistant Vice Chancellor of Governmental and Community Relations here at UC Riverside. On behalf of our Chancellor, our distinguished faculty, staff, students, and supporters, welcome to the Bipartisan Leadership in California conversation. As a campus, we take tremendous pride in our diversity, and we are deeply committed to maintaining a campus that encourages intellectual growth and spirited discussion. As such, UC Riverside is delighted to serve as tonight's host for a conversation by Speaker Anthony Rendon, a UCR alumnus, and Minority Leader Chad Mays. We're also grateful to the various elected officials that are here supporting our campus. And if I can just take a moment to ask the elected officials or staff members that are here representing our members to please stand to be acknowledged. UCR appreciates your support. As one of the most diverse research universities in the nation, we strive to be a place where all, regardless of their background, can thrive and succeed. It's now my pleasure to introduce Victoria Ciudad Leal, who will lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance. Thank you.
Everybody please rise and face the flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. You may now be seated.
Thank you, Elizabeth and Victoria, and good evening to everyone. I am Anil Deolalekar. I'm the founding dean of the School of Public Policy, which, along with the Center for California Studies, is co-hosting this event tonight. We are very honored to be doing this event, this special bipartisan conversation with Assembly Speaker Anthony Rendon and Assembly Republican Leader Chad Mays. You know, at the School of Public Policy, which is, to many of you who may know this already, it's the newest school on the UCR campus. It was established just 3 years ago, and we are graduating our first Masters of Public Policy cohort this June. Thank you. Thank you. And what we do at the School of Public Policy is help build tomorrow's policy and political leaders, leaders who will go out and serve our communities and our state and our nation. And part of being a successful policymaker or a political leader is the ability to compromise and cooperate and collaborate with people that you might not always agree with. And you have to do this for the good of the community, good of the state, good of the nation. And I hope that our students at the School of Public Policy and students in general here today, as they traverse their paths to becoming future leaders, will not just take note of, but also be inspired by the bipartisan cooperation that Speaker Rendon and Assemblymember Mays exemplify. So I would like to again applaud the bipartisan cooperation that you have shown in Sacramento. It is a model for the rest of the nation. I only wish our leaders in Washington, D.C. could emulate you. This special event would not have happened without the support of the offices of State Senator Richard Roth, Assemblymember Jose Medina, and Assemblymember Sabrina Cervantes. Thank you for your involvement in this very important undertaking. We are also very grateful to the numerous civic organizations that have co-sponsored this event, and I'm just going to list the main co-sponsors now. Chicano Latino alumni of UCR, Greater Riverside Chambers of Commerce, the Group, Inland Empire Economic Partnership, Latino Network, the League of Women Voters, NAACP Riverside Branch, and the UCR Office of Governmental and Community Relations, whose Associate Vice Chancellor Romero just spoke us to. Thank you for your partnership. And with that, I would like to request Steve Boilard, the Executive Director for the Center for California Studies, our co-host for today's event, to come up to the stage.
Well, good evening. Yes, I'm Steve Boilard, the Executive Director of the Center for California Studies at Sacramento State. Welcome. This is actually our third installment of the Speakers Lecture Series. It's something that the Center for California Studies is just excited to be part of. We helped to develop this with the Speaker's Office. You know, it's a way to try and get a connection between our governmental leaders and our academic communities. This is an idea that, that the speaker himself had come up with, and we're happy to be part of making that happen. It's especially exciting tonight because this theme of bipartisan leadership in California is something that is very dear to my heart, and I think to many of us. There is so much of a need to be able to demonstrate that we as a people can overcome differences, overcome divides, overcome party differences and other kinds of labels we put on ourselves, and work towards a greater good. And I think that California can really be a leader in illustrating how that can happen. And I think, you know, often people look to California to see what the future of the country could look like, so let's hope this is one of those ways in which we can really demonstrate leadership on bipartisan leadership. This theme is very much in the wheelhouse for us at the Center for California Studies. Our mission is to bridge academia and government in the service of California's democracy. And this is certainly one way that we help to make that happen. We're also perhaps best known for our Capital Fellows program, which takes college graduates and places them in one-year paid positions in state government, in the legislature, the executive branch, or the superior courts. And this is a way to try and really build leadership capacity, another generation of leadership capacity for the state government. I want to acknowledge one of our alums, Kevin Liao. Kevin, are you in the room here? There, in the back of the room. He had been an Assembly Fellow in 2012-13. He works with the Speaker's Office, and he's really been instrumental in making the Speaker Series come to life. So I want to acknowledge that, and thank you, Kevin. And next to Kevin is my colleague, Pam Chu. Pam is the director of the Assembly Fellows Program, again, one of our 4 fellowship programs, and Pam's really been one of the main forces in making this event and the other 2 speakers events that we've done recently come together. So thank you, Pam, for your work. So now I'd like to introduce Assembly Member Jose Medina, who, among other notable accomplishments, is one of the other people in the room that's celebrating St. Patrick's Day a day early. I wasn't going to be wearing a tie tomorrow, and I said, I bought this tie last year, and I said, I'm going to put it on one day early, and then I was thankful to see that Assemblymember Medina is doing the same thing. His looks better. We are all in his district, the 61st Assembly District, and so we appreciate the hospitality that the Assembly member is extending to us. His district also includes Riverside, Moreno Valley, Paris, and Meade Valley. He is also a UC Riverside alum. Shameless applaud line, but And he's also chair of the Assembly Higher Education Committee, which I think, given our setting here, and again, on this theme of bridging academia and government, really is just the ideal person to have introduce our panelists. So, Honorable Assemblyman Medina.
Well, it's great to be celebrating a day early. So as the Assembly member of the 61st Assembly District, and as Steve said, as an alum of UC Riverside, it is indeed my pleasure to welcome our speaker, Anthony Rendon, and the Minority Leader, Chad Mays, to UCR and to the 61st Assembly District. Welcome. Well, I know that both of these individuals are people who are very well known to the community, but I have the pleasure to saying a few words about each of them. First, let me start with our speaker, Anthony Rendon. Ph.D. graduate of UC Riverside, class of 2000. Dr. Anthony Rendon. So Speaker Rendon was sworn in as the 70th Speaker of the California Assembly just about a year ago, almost to the day, in 2016. In his first year as Speaker, he passed a series of landmark progressive legislation, including the nation's first $15 an hour minimum wage, he passed the extension of California's climate change reduction goals, and a landmark bill that provided for overtime pay for farm workers. As well as groundbreaking policies on gun control and tobacco use. So it is my honor to welcome my good friend, Speaker Anthony Rendon. Go ahead. Next, it's my pleasure to introduce my other good friend, the Minority Leader, Chad Mays. Chad Mays was first elected to the Assembly in November 2014 and represents the 42nd District in the California State Assembly. The Inland Empire District encompasses parts of San Bernardino and Riverside counties. In the Assembly, Mr. Mays quickly developed a solid reputation as a dynamic, hardworking, and effective leader, and was elected Republican leader by his peers after only 10 months in office. I think that's worth applause. As a self-described governing conservative, he seeks to identify pragmatic policy solutions that will better the lives of all Californians and ensure that the state remains a global leader in the 21st century. And on a personal note, you may have read in the Press Enterprise about the bromance that exists between these two gentlemen, and I understand that because Mr. Mays is certainly someone who reaches out to all members of the Assembly, including myself. So I'm honored to call him a friend. And last, I'd like to introduce someone who doesn't need any introduction to UC Riverside, someone who you all know very well and who we know very well in Sacramento for all the time that he spends there. And that is Dr. Karthick Ramakrishnan. And Dr. Karthick Ramakrishnan is Associate Dean of the UCR School of Public Policy, Professor of Public Policy and Political Science. He's also a board member of the California Endowment and a global fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center and a chair of the California Statewide APIA Commission. He received his Ph.D. in political science from Princeton University. My sympathies for the loss against Notre Dame this morning. And his research focuses on civic participation immigration policy and the politics of race, ethnicity, and immigration in the United States. He has published many articles and 6 books, including the most recent, Framing Immigration and the New Immigration Federation. Dr. Karthick Ramakrishnan.
So I'm going to, they told us we can only have 2 mics here, but first of all, please, again, a round of applause to Assemblymember Medina for his continued leadership, especially on higher education, but on so many other matters that are so vital, not only to here locally in Riverside, but to our state. Okay, so we're gonna try to mix it up a little bit here. So we're gonna have it where I have a set of questions that we discussed briefly. There might be some wild cards in here. I do have some notes that people have already put out. So we'll just get started. So one that's already been referenced is this bromance. So I hate to sound like the dating game, but I got to start off by saying, so how did you guys first meet? Like how?
Love at first sight.
I don't know when we first met. There was a pretty big group of freshmen. I got elected 2 years before Chad, so I'm sure at some point we met on the floor of the assembly, and on the floor of the assembly chamber, and then but shortly after I was elected speaker, but before sworn in, Chad called me up and offered to come to my district, which is pretty far drive from Apple Valley to southeast Los Angeles County. Went to a Mexican restaurant across the street from my office, drank beer, which is kind of our go-to. Yeah, it was kind of like, these chairs are a perfect height. This is kind of where we spend most of our time. Exactly. Yeah, I'm kind of disappointed there's only water here. But yeah, we talked that first time when he was already minority leader and I was speaker-elect. We probably talked for a couple of hours, and we've been, ever since, we've had this great relationship, and probably a monthly beer.
Is that the way you remember it, Chad?
Yeah, it was. There's other things, but we can't talk about them. And yeah, I mean, it really the first time I think we just connected is Speaker Anthony Rendon, right? It was always the Speaker of the State Assembly in California, but he's a pretty down to earth guy. In fact, I was just walking in hearing it's Dr. Anthony Rendon. I feel like I've been downgraded, not calling him doctor, since he's got this fancy Ph.D. from here. But in the past, speakers up in Sacramento have had much larger egos, where I think the trappings of it all, like having several different sergeants walk you around places, or having fancy cars drive you around. You see Anthony walking around by himself. In fact, I think he tries to get away from sergeants as much as he possibly can. He's just a down-to-earth guy. And the one thing that was very clear in that first time we were hanging out there at that Mexican restaurant was just the fact that he cares about people, and it's real. What you'll hear, and I'm sure we'll hear more of this tonight, but we come from different backgrounds. We see the world from different lenses, but I think what you see with Anthony is his genuineness, that he really does genuinely care about people and wants to make people's lives better here in California, and I think we both share that.
Excellent. So, well, this is great. I think we're lucky to be living in a moment where our top leaders in the assembly genuinely like each other. It'd be good if this could be replicated elsewhere. But thinking about Sacramento more broadly, are you seeing more of this kind of intrapersonal relationship building, or are you guys just this odd couple?
No, I mean, I think a couple things have happened. Term limits. It was just now, I guess 2012 was the first, so the first members that came in 2012 could be there for 12 years. Prior to that, I think it was the early 90s, mid-90s when that was changed, is that you were only going to be able to be in the assembly for 6 years. So if you just stop and think about that for just 1 second, you get elected your first time, you serve for 2 years, you run one more time. As soon as you run that second time, you've only got one more race and you're done. you're starting to think about the next office that you're going to run for, whether it be state senate or maybe a congressional seat or maybe a supervisorial seat. So very quickly, you're finding an enemy, whether it's in your own party, right? So the caucuses, the Democratic caucuses were at odds with one another. The Republican caucuses were at odds with one another. And they're always looking for the next job. I think now, knowing that we're going to be here for 12 years, you have this scenario where you've got folks who, I could be here for a while and actually want to get along with the people that I'm working with. And I think that's probably the biggest reason. But beyond that, you'll see that quite a bit. In Sacramento, for political events, fundraising events, I just went to one the other night with Monique Limon. She's a new member, and I walked in and I said to her, Monique, you better be careful. There are more Republicans in here than there are Democrats. Back in Washington, D.C., you will not see that. In fact, Democrats don't go to Republican fundraising events, and Republicans don't go to Democratic fundraising events. But you'll see that in Sacramento, a lot of folks working together.
Yeah, I think Chad's right about the 12-year term limit extensions. Makes a big difference. It makes a big difference from the perspective of, A, you're going to kind of be with these folks for a while, so why would you want to burn bridges? At the same time, you just get to know people on a very human level, and you also start to think about. We're talking right now about transportation. We're talking about water. We're talking about housing. We're talking about long-term infrastructural fixes. And first of all, you don't do those things overnight. And secondly, you certainly don't do it without involving every part of the state, every sort of environment, which necessarily you have to sort of involve every sort of political ideology. And I think the other dynamic about, Jose Medina and I I feel like I just got here to the legislature. We'd be starting our last term right now, which is mind-boggling. And when you start to develop sort of institutional knowledge of what it takes to get a bill passed, you start to think about things like accountability and doing oversight. All of that takes a tremendous amount of cooperation. And there's a lot of what we do is not ideological. When you talk about oversight and holding people accountable, that's when you're bringing an agency in, that's not about ideology. A lot of the bills we do around business and professions are not ideological. So there's a lot of opportunities to work together, but I think given the extension of 12-year term limits, we're kind of taking advantage of that. And for whatever reason, it also, I think, just happens to be a really great collection of people. I'm obviously very close friends with Chad, but Brian Dolly represents that northeastern part of the state. His district borders Oregon and Nevada. So if you can picture sort of that triangular corner of the state, he and I ideologically have nothing in common. The first time I met him, he said something like, I have 172 guns. And I said, I don't have any. And he offered to give me one, which is a sign of what a good guy he is. But I've been to his district, I think 2 or 3 times. I've been into his home. So we're really fortunate to have a really good collection of people right now.
Great. Well, the next question I want to ask is going beyond, in some ways is interpersonal relationships can be a building block or maybe a hindrance if there's bad blood or bad relationships. But surely there needs to be some basis of policy agreement somewhere for these things to happen, right? For these deals to get done. So can you talk a little bit about that, about what, either agreements in terms of the goals, even if people might disagree about the means, but what is the kind of fundamental basis of policy agreement that you need in order for cooperation to happen?
Go first, go.
And maybe use some examples.
Sure. I think, first of all, in terms of political ideology, Chad is a conservative. I am a progressive. I guess we call ourselves progressive now. I still call myself a liberal. So in terms of the ideological perspective, we couldn't be further apart. That being said, I think we both are very realistic about the world, and we want to get stuff done. I think that's sort of our driving force. When people talk about Sacramento and they talk about the way the sausage is made, it's not pretty. Making legislation is not pretty. And if you have this sense of I've written bills where you write it at the start, you're like, oh, it's a beautiful bill. And they always tell you not to fall in love with your bill because by the end, it doesn't look like that at all, particularly if it gets passed. So I think you, I think you have to have a sense of, you have to go into it knowing that you're not going to create this perfect product. And that in and of itself.
Unlike your dissertation.
Unlike my dissertation, which is the finest thing ever written. But you have to go into it with this sense of, I'm not here to burn the house down. I'm here to get things done. And if I can move the ball forward a little bit, then that's something of an accomplishment. And I think we both sort of share that outlook. And so examples, the water bond, which we did 2 years. Were you there for the water bond? I wasn't. No. Okay, you missed it. No.
But it had Republican support.
I think all Republicans but one voted for it. Tim Donnelly, who votes against everything. And one Democrat voted against it. Other than that, it was unanimous bipartisan support, I believe. It's a couple of years ago now. The MCO tax is another example. But yeah, I mean, we've done a lot together.
Well, the first thing I think probably to start off with is understanding the dynamics up in Sacramento as well. So in the state assembly, this legislative session, there are 55 Democrats in the assembly, and there are 25 Republicans. So the first thing you have to understand is to get a majority vote bill done as a Republican, it has to be bipartisan, right? It's not going to get done without Democratic support. So, our strategy, we're talking about moving things ahead. It is that idea of working inside the building and working with folks across the aisle to say, hey, we think this is good for California. We hope that you think that this is good for California as well. Talk a little bit about the MCO financing deal, others would call it the MCO tax. But the MCO financing plan was one of those things that I was intimately involved in. The state of California was going to miss out on a couple $2 billion in revenue because the federal government let the state know that we were doing something incorrectly in the way that we had our MCO tax, the way that it was done. And so they needed Republican votes to be able to make...
MCO, what does that stand for?
That is the Managed Care Organization tax. If I start to talk about it, you guys will get lost in the weeds. But it's, right? Yeah, incredibly boring. I can talk for an hour. Yeah, we're not going to do that. But again, this idea that, hey, we're on Team California here, right? We want to make sure that California gets its fair share of the dollars from Washington, D.C. We all live here in California. We want to make sure that California can thrive. Is there a way that we can put that together that fits the way that we see the world and make sure that we can get that revenue to California? And so working with the governor, working with the speaker, and working with the Senate Pro Tem, we ended up putting a deal together that brought back, made sure that California got a couple $2 billion. And it takes that sort of, at some point you got to stop and think about things, not just from the ideological lens that you think the world is not perfect. It's not perfect. Sometimes you got to look beyond that and be able to sit down and look to figure out ways of getting things done, even though things aren't as pure as they could be.
Well, I see one other example here. Either of you guys or both of you can talk about it. No Place Like Home. Can you say more about that?
Yeah. Speaking of a couple $2 billion, the Senate Pro Tem had put together a deal, the No Place Like Home initiative, to be able to provide housing for the homeless. That also was something that took 2/3 last session. So we worked very closely with the Senate Pro Tem to make sure that there was funding for veterans and others, and something that we got done. You want to talk about that?
More weed stuff, but yeah, it was an important piece of legislation. I think that may have been the first time I saw you in the governor's office, which was kind of cool. And when you walk in the governor's office and you see Republican leadership there, you think, oh, we're doing something big. Because, I mean, don't mean this arrogantly, but just mathematically, we don't need Republicans to accomplish a lot, although we'd love to. Yeah. So, I mean, that was it was a great example of us sort of, working together, and it was not Chad sort of, kicking his feet and saying like, oh, why are we doing this? It was like, what's best for California? And I was actually thinking I think it was last fall, October, September, October, we went to D.C. as well. Went to Washington, D.C. We did a bipartisan lobbying trip. Imagine that. Imagine going to Washington, D.C. as a Democrat and a Republican. And this is just before the presidential, right? So we go to D.C. to do this lobbying trip, and I'm like, wow, I'm in Kevin McCarthy's office. I don't imagine I could have gotten there on my own. And, you know, we had meetings that, you know, where we talked about the sort of common need for a great example, homeless vouchers. We have something like 22% of the states, of the country's homeless veterans in California, but we only get about 16% of the homeless veterans vouchers. So Chad and I talked about that and the need to kind of make sure that California was getting its fair share.
Great. So the next question I have, and maybe there aren't that many examples yet, but have there been issues, say, of factionalism within parties where, as leaders within your respective parties, it becomes a bit challenging? You guys have no factions in the Republicans?
Yeah, I mean, we have a lot of factions in our party. There's ideological factions, obviously, geographic factions. I think we've been able to kind of, when you were listing our accomplishments last year, when Chad wasn't applauding, we were talking about minimum wage and farm worker overtime and the gun bills. That was sort of, we were able to kind of overcome those. And I think sort of collectively as a caucus, at least in the Democratic caucus, I think it's a bit analogous to what Chad and I do. I mean, I think when there's a heavy lift and we know we have to do something big as a caucus, we usually kind of gather together. But it's difficult sometimes, and the reality is in a big caucus in a diverse state, 38.5 million people, a lot of different geography. We were having drinks a couple nights ago with Frank Bigelow, who's a great guy, wears a cowboy hat and has a ranch. That's not really my reality in Southeast Los Angeles County, in Cudahy and Bell and Maywood. So, you know, there's a tremendous diversity I think in both caucuses, even if it may not necessarily manifest itself ideologically.
Okay, so the next question is talking about some other issues and thinking about areas of agreement before we start talking about areas of disagreement and how you guys deal with that. So potential areas of agreement, one of them, poverty, right? California has either one of or maybe close to the highest poverty rate in the country. Where can Democrats and Republicans in the state come together to address that situation?
This is something I talk a lot about as the Republican leader. It's not one of those normal Republican issues that one would want to talk about, but there are two different measures. There's the official poverty measure, and then there's the supplemental poverty measure that the Census Bureau puts out. If you use the supplemental poverty measure, California has the highest poverty rate in the nation. Washington, D.C. as a city would be up there as well. But as far as the state's concerned, California is head and shoulders above the rest. And so for me, it's one of those things that if I look at how well we're doing as a state for everyone in California, that's the one measuring stick that I think that we can use to see how well we're doing. And if we use that as the measuring stick, we're not doing very well. So for me, being a member of the state assembly, being a member of the board of directors for the state of California, I want to go out and I want to fix that. I want to change that. And so whether you're a Republican or you're a Democrat, we all need to agree that we want to make sure that California is a place where all people can thrive, where all individuals.
I'm going to clap for that one. That's like, no, absolutely.
That should be our goal. I came from local government. You know, I started as a council member in a little tiny town just up the road in Yucca Valley, 21,000 people, and I felt like it was my goal to make sure that people's lives were better in Yucca Valley. And then I was a chief of staff to a county supervisor in San Bernardino County, and when I was there, I felt like it was my job to help my boss try to make San Bernardino County a better place to live. Now being a member of the board of directors of the state of California, shouldn't it be my job to try to make California a better place to live? So let's get beyond the labels and then figure out what is it that's the cause, and then how can we fix the cause to make sure that people's lives are better. So I'm sure you're going to bring this up at some point, because it's one of those things that comes up in almost every conversation that I have, is housing costs. The reason why we have the highest poverty rate in the nation is because our housing costs are extraordinary. I talked to a developer in Orange County the other day, and he said that the average new single-family home, detached home in Orange County is $970,000. Now, do you think that a firefighter or a teacher or a plumber can afford to buy a house for $970,000? There's no way. So we have to stop and think about what's the cause and effect of all of that. And so it can't just be government subsidized housing, because we just don't have enough money to be able to do that. We've got to get some more supply. And I think the way that you do that is you have to reduce some of the regulatory hurdles to be able to get there. So those are some of those things. As Republicans and Democrats, we can sit down and look at the problem, and then let's figure out together how we get the solution.
Okay, Anthony, any thoughts? Both on poverty and housing affordability?
Sure. Well, first of all, when I was sworn in last March 7th, my speech was all based around poverty. That's sort of the theme of, that's what I did. I spent about 20 years in the nonprofit sector working in poverty reduction programs, and my speech was all about poverty. And then to have Chad talk as he has over the course of the past year about poverty really makes you feel like you have a partner and someone who identifies the same problem that you do. And you know, when we meet, we talk a little bit about procedural stuff, like what we're going to do, and for the most part, it's about our lives and our experiences. And often we talk about sort of, you know, our brushes with constituents in our district and those things that kind of impact them. So this issue is very personal for both Chad and I. I represent 9 cities. 8 of those cities have poverty rates of 20% or more. So to have Chad identify this issue as really important to him and important to the Republican caucus is music to my ears. We worked on the state's earned income tax credit program together. That was a bipartisan issue that was really important. I think continues to be important to the caucus. Last year in the state budget, we devoted, I think, $530 million to early childhood education, which a lot of studies have shown also helps to alleviate poverty as well. But the single biggest indicator of poverty is the percent of your income that you spend on housing. So Chad is absolutely correct about this being something that we need to work on. We have an incredible number of bills this year on housing, and eventually we'll kind of whittle them down and try to move some forward. But I spent a lot of time, as Chad did, working on campaigns throughout the state. And we were actually in the same district most of the time. And whether you're up in Walnut Creek, or you're in San Luis Obispo, or you're right here in the Inland Empire, you keep hearing 2 things. You hear, first of all, about people's commutes, the extent to which people have to drive a long way in order to get to work, and you continually hear about people's housing costs. So that we absolutely positively agree on that as an issue, and then we'll try to figure out how to get there together.
Great. Well, looking forward to seeing what you guys come up with, especially on the housing front. Next is on workforce development. I know that's a big issue in our region, but in our state as well. How are either of you or both of you thinking about this?
You know, we've got the Republican caucus is actually working with a handful of Democrats now on a handful of bills. I don't have all those bills with me. But it really is just this idea, when you talk about workforce development, there are, in California, individuals who are probably not going to go to college. They're probably not going to go to UCR. There's a lot of folks here in the Inland Empire. In fact, if I remember, I see Dr. Husing, he can tell me if my numbers are right. But I think it's 47%, if I remember correctly, of individuals, working individuals here in the Inland Empire that have not spent a day in college, don't have a degree, they haven't gone to get an associate's degree or a bachelor's degree. And so while it's great to think about a life for folks who have gone to UCR, who have gone to UCLA, or have gone to Stanford, we've also got to make sure that we're providing education for those individuals to go get a job, to begin to get a career. And what are we going to do about that? And we've got to make sure that we're providing incentives for them to go get the education to make sure that they can get the skills that they need for a career. And I don't think that that's a Republican or a Democrat issue. You should clap right now. I think that that's a responsibility that we have as legislators to make sure that the resources that we have are going to where it needs to be to make sure that we can lift people up.
This is probably why people aren't interested in state politics. We agree too much.
Now we'll get to the disagreements.
Yeah, okay, good. Yeah, I was wondering when we kiss. Workforce, I mean, I guess the only other thing I would add is it's important to think about workforce development, particularly within the context of the way that our economy is so rapidly growing. When you start talking about driverless cars, that's exciting, but it's also threatening, particularly to regions such as this. I saw an interesting map the other day. It's a map of the United States, all 50 states, and it lists the number one the number one job in every state, and truck driver is something like 37 or 38 states. It's the number one job. So I think we definitely need to look at workforce development, but we need to be sort of ahead of the curve and kind of think about where we're going to be 10, 15, 20, 25 years out.
Great, and I'll just make a brief plug that UCR is partnering and entering into different types of both research and implementation activities with groups like IEP on the kind of workforce development and how it ties to education, but also with county and other agencies to try to promote economic and workforce development. Next thing, maybe you'll get more applause here, or boos. College affordability, right? So maybe this is an area of disagreement. So, I mean, okay, lately there was something proposed, yesterday? Or on dramatically making college more affordable to a much larger group of people. But what looks viable, and especially if we're talking about reaching across the aisle here?
It was actually on Monday. It's a long week. It seemed like yesterday, but it was Monday. The Democratic caucus, we came out with our something package. It has a cute name, something. Diploma's not debt. Thank you, Mr. Medina. Diploma's not debt.
Right, education.
Was that yours? Is that how you remember? It probably is. We'll credit that to Jose Medina. Diploma's not debt. Which is our college affordability plan. It comes at a price tag of about $1.6 billion over the course of the next 5 years, and it's right now it looks as it's something that Mr. Medina is going to work out in his committee, and we'll take a look at it in the budget as well. There's a lot of students here. I'm going to make them groan. I always tell the story about I started college at 20. After working I was a terrible high school student, first of all, and then ended up working in factories and warehouses until I was about 20. And I went to a community college where I paid $5 a semester. And then I transferred to Cal State Fullerton where I paid $283 a semester. And then I got my Ph.D. here and did postdoc at Boston University. I ended up with about less than $5,000 in debt. It's a lot of education, not a lot of dollars. And we know it's a very different California now. So this is something that Mr. Medina, our higher ed chair, I'm not punting to you. This is something that we're all going to work together, Democrats and Republicans alike. With Mr. Medina's leadership, we're kind of formulating what we want to do. But what we kicked off on Monday, I think, was a good first step. Say one more thing. I'm sorry. I want to say one more thing. Growing up in the environment that I grew up in, and for I think a lot of Californians, that low-cost, high-quality higher education system was really the sort of pathway to the middle class. And if that's cut off, then what kind of a society are we? What kind of a state are we?
He had to get his applause line in. Yeah, you like that? That was very nice. We were debating this last fall in the Republican caucus, and some of our folks about proposing free community college in California as Republicans. Well, here's one thing: about 80%, for 80% of the students, it's already free. There's a BOG waiver, so it's really just for those other 20%. We got into this with the Legislative Analyst Office and that kind of thing, and realized maybe it wasn't the greatest idea to do that, and then the Democrats came out with that this week. The truth is, there's a couple of things we've got to do. I just signed a letter this morning by Kevin McCarty, who was out circulating signatures, because there are some universities in California that bring in some out-of-state students. And when there's out-of-state students that get in line, that makes it to where there isn't enough because they pay a higher rate. That means there's not enough slots for students here in California. And I can tell you there were just as many, I think, in fact, every Republican that I saw Kevin put that in front of, they were signing it. I signed it this morning, so that's one of those things where Democrats and Republicans agree. I'm sure some of the UC executives, if they're watching right now, are cringing as I say that. But we do think that use a line, maybe Californians first, California first. And when we're talking about our education system, we want to make sure that Californians are first in line. I can't help but to say this as well. We have to be a little careful when we're talking about higher education. The college that I went to after my community college, I went for a couple of years. I went back to a school in Central Virginia, and when I was there at that school in Central Virginia, I ended up working very hard, putting myself through. My parents couldn't help out. They couldn't afford to be able to help me out, to be able to go to college. But I went to school in some temporary buildings, steel-clad, sided buildings. Wasn't that fancy. That school today is doing much better. It has a year-round, on campus, a year-round ski slope. A year-round ski slope. I was staying in a dorm where I had 3 other people in the size of probably 250 square feet. Now they've got fancy apartments that people are living in. So what school once was is now changed to try to get recruits. So we have to be careful, too, that the costs for education aren't getting too crazy. We want to make sure that the priority is to educate students, and we don't have all these other frills that go along with it.
Okay. Well, the next issue, I think maybe will produce some disagreement, maybe not, is on healthcare spending and what the future of that will look like, especially given what we know so far, at least about the Ryan plan, and what California might do to respond.
So just last week, Dr. Jim Wood, he's a dentist that represents the North Coast. He's the chair of health. I, and my policy guy went back to Washington, D.C. last week. The idea was, again, this idea of California first, or we're all on Team California. We went back to figure out what they were baking back in Washington, D.C. Being the Republican leader, it was easy for me to walk into some Republican offices and for them to feel like they could talk to me. So we went back to figure out what they're baking. On the plane ride, or on in the car to get to the plane, I got a text message that they'd already announced what they had baked, which was the AHCA, is what they're calling it now. So quickly trying to study it, a little bit on the plane. The next morning, took the red eye that evening, began to have our meetings to get an understanding of what it was that they had put together. And one of the things that is even though I believe, and I'll tell you, I don't think that the Affordable Care Act was a great plan. It had some serious problems. I can give you some personal examples of the problems that the ACA had. But one of the things that it did for California is there's this Medicaid expansion population. And with that Medicaid expansion population, there was some thought that maybe that was just gonna go away. And if that went away, that would be an $8 billion hit to the state general fund. Now we have a $125 billion budget, so an $8 billion hit to the general fund is a lot of money. That's a tremendous amount of money. And so we wanted to dig in to figure out what it was and how they were going to do that. So they're still working on it back in Washington, D.C. That isn't going to be an $8 billion hit. It's going to be more of a soft landing. It won't happen. I'll start to get in the weeds. But 2020, and then we've got to figure out what the churn is between those that are going to get off of be out of the Medicaid population. It's going to take a little bit of time. But we don't yet know exactly what the impacts are going to be. But it's something that I think we've got to work together. I'm also, because I believe in Team California, and I don't want Anthony to kick me here, I also think that it's important to not be antagonistic to what's going on back in Washington, D.C. We have to understand, like we do here in California, that my ideas here in California, I wish they weren't, but my ideas are a minority opinion in California. Well, across the country, people don't think like we do in aggregate here in California. And so it's important to make sure that we're civil and respectful, and we understand where other people are coming from, and to understand why decisions they're making are the decisions that they are making. Without going into more of the weeds about what they're putting together back there, again, I think it's important for us to first understand what's gonna happen. My guess is, by the way, my prediction is that the current bill, after it's gotten out of committee, will pass the House. I'm not convinced that it gets out of the Senate without serious amendments.
Okay, so the thing I'm going to ask, well, actually, Anthony, you say what you're going to say, and then I'm going to ask.
I don't have much to add other than you're at a public policy school and people cheer Medicaid expansion. Yay, it's my favorite player. No, I think Chad nailed it. We've looked at it. If we were going to have to replace the program here in California, it starts at a $20 billion price tag. So the implications are profound, to say the least.
So one thing, Chad, you'd kind of hinted at is, do you get any flack for being buddies with Anthony when Anthony's so publicly, a public face of the resistance in California?
I haven't gotten flack for that, but I'll give you one where I actually got tremendous amount of flack for. So we were both, was the speaker-elect. I was, at the time, Republican leader-elect, because I hadn't yet taken over the job. And Anthony called me and said, "Hey, Chad, I would be honored if you would second my nomination to become speaker." And that hadn't happened very much, if it had happened at all, in the building. And so I thought about it and went, "Wow, I feel pretty honored that he would call and even ask." So I wanted to. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's right. So I said, "Well, let me think. Actually, you know what? I don't think I need to think about it." And he actually said, "This might create some political problems for you. So why don't you give it 24 hours and then get back to me?" And I said, "Well, okay, I'll run it up the flagpole to kind of find out to see if there's any problems. But I'm more inclined to be able to do that." Well, I went out, talked to a few folks, my leadership team, and they said, "No, we think that's a great idea." So we did that. Well, then, after doing that, there was some bloggers, some conservative activists that were not thrilled with me doing that. But I'll tell you, I would do it all over again, because they'll tell you if we sit down and when we're having our beers and we have these conversations, we do see the world from completely different perspectives. But there's no reason why we can't sit across the table from each other, drink a beer, and have those conversations. In fact, I think that this country would be much better off if we all did that. For some reason, and I'm actually getting on a soapbox, so you shouldn't kick me and tell me to stop, but for some reason we feel the need to be able to sit behind our computers and get on Facebook and say awful, horrible, nasty things about people that you've never met before, like what's in their mind, or to send an email in, just nasty, horrible emails, thinking that you understand where they're coming from and what their life experiences were. At some point in time, you got to check yourself And I think in this country, and I think even in this state, at some point we need to check ourselves to understand where it is, who we are, and the way that we're going to sit and resolve our differences. Because if we continue down the road that we are, this is not going to be a great country. This is not going to be a great state.
Yes, thank you.
So a couple things. First of all, just for the sake of everyone's information, all the locals here, when I called you and asked you to second my nomination, I was actually at the Mission Inn. Were you really? I was down the street at the Mission Inn. It was Christmas time, and it was pretty, and yeah, and I called up Chad and asked him, and he said, yeah, sure, and I said, well, you should think
This
about
is
it.
so romantic.
It is very, yeah, exactly. It is, yeah. It's twirling my hair. And then someone saw me on the plane flying over when we were flying over here, and I was rereading an Ernest Hemingway book, and I said I never read about politics. I only read fiction. I never read about politics. It just that's the day job. And when Chad was talking right now, it reminded me of like the first book that ever really moved me was like a lot of young people, was A Catcher in the Rye, and I remember a part where Holden Caulfield says, if I close my eyes, I can punch somebody in the face. But if I open my eyes, I can't hit them. And I think it's that sort of ability to see someone else's humanity that makes it really difficult. Once you recognize humanity in someone's eyes, this is getting romantic again. Once you see that sense of humanity and so much of what we do is public. So much of what we do is at press conferences and in front of people, in front of large audiences. To sit at a bar with Chad, to hear him talk about poverty, to hear him talk about the impact of different changes on his district, when no one is around but a bartender, says a lot about who he is as a person. So that's for me. That's been the sort of joy of getting to know him.
So for the press secretaries that are here, I think that's an op-ed right there. What you guys just set up here, you should totally do it. Well, I mean, I think you already touched upon this. Maybe we don't need to do it more. Is there a good way and a bad way to disagree? Because you are going to have disagreements in the chamber, right? So can you say a bit about how you're trying to change the culture? I know that the Senate recently had a slip-up. I don't know if you want to address that.
I was just going to say, in fact, a bad way is when somebody's up there talking to get the sergeant to kick him out of the chambers. That's a bad way to deal with disagreements. If you guys aren't familiar with that, just a few weeks ago, Senator Janet Wynn got up and spoke, and it didn't go over real well with the presiding officer in the Senate, and they called the sergeants while she was speaking and sent her out, and didn't look very good upon the Senate, didn't look very good upon the institution. I will say, though, that isn't something that has happened in the Assembly. That isn't the way that the Speaker runs the Assembly.
We need to bring the pro tem here next
Yeah,
time.
yeah, exactly.
I think they expressed regret for that, right?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. I think so. In regards to disagreements, if we sat and actually had a debate on how we get to the same path, we're going to disagree an awful lot on how to get there. I'm somebody that believes that government has a role to play, but it doesn't have the only role to play. In fact, I would say that I think the private sector needs to take a larger role in solving some of these societal ills. I think that churches need to take a larger role in some of these societal ills. I'm guessing you would probably say that's probably the case, but I think you would think that the government has a larger role to play to be able to fix these or to get to that same end. But again, it's just sitting down is a good way to disagree. Yeah, it's to say, hey, I don't agree with you. And then what he does is, we got the votes.
And
sorry, Chad.
and we do have the votes over and over and over again. I forget.
Might makes right.
Right, yeah. I think I forgot the question.
Is there a good or a bad way to disagree, at least in terms of how business is conducted. In the
Yeah,
same
I mean,
way.
I feel like we've been doing it the right way, and I appreciate Chad acknowledging that. I think it's funny, today's Thursday, today's getaway day, today's the day that all the Southern Californians get on the plane, the day that Northern Californians get in their cars, and we would love to be done in 10 minutes. We would love to be done with business quickly, but we don't. We debate things. We talk about things. And every single mic that goes up, whether it's a Democratic mic or a Republican mic, everybody gets to speak and gets to have their say. And just from the standpoint of just sort of blowing off steam, I think that's usually the best way. I mean, if people have their say, that's that's in a democracy. Sometimes that's all you can really ask for.
Okay, next set of questions relate to Sacramento and how it impacts local governments. So how can local governments better ensure that Sacramento is serving the needs of their communities? And I'll ask about three things. So first, about cap and trade funds. Next, about local control funding formula. And then finally, generally about empowering local governments more.
I come from local government, so I'm one of those that believe that government that's closest to the people is best. I do believe that. I was sad to see, I was not in the legislature yet, but I was sad to see when redevelopment agencies went away. They needed to be reformed for sure, because there were some issues and some abuse. But now that they're gone, it'll be interesting to see what happens here in the coming years. I do also have to say though, as a Yucca Valley council member, I learned very early, and I was a member of the League of Cities Board of Directors, I learned to tell people that it wasn't Yucca Valley's fault or wasn't city's fault, it was the county's fault and it was the state's fault. When I went to work for Janice Rutherford in San Bernardino County, I learned to say that it was the city's fault and it was the state's fault. And now that I'm on the state, I tend to think that it's the county's fault and it's the local government's fault. The truth is we are all in this together, whether you get elected at a local government or you're elected at the state, we're all in this together. We gotta stop thinking about these things in terms of us versus them and begin to work towards those challenges. You talk about the LCFF, I mean, that's what the governor, and it was his proposal to be able to push these things back down to local school districts and to be able to let them make the decision. Cap and trade was another one that you talked about. I think that was done incorrectly. It ended up where the cap and trade dollars that came in ended up going mostly to the San Francisco Bay Area, and Southern California did not get its fair share. There's a couple more examples that you had there. And those two. Yeah. So I think it's one of those things when we're talking about local government, I'm a big believer in local governance. Some people use that term local control. I'm a Republican, so I don't like that term local control. But this idea of local governance, I think is important. And I think as much as we can, California is such a huge state, the more power that we can give back to counties and cities and to school districts and water districts to make decisions, I think it's going to be better.
Unlike Chad, I don't come from local government. My first run for office was when I ran for the assembly, but I do have a wife who is a consultant to the League of California Cities, and every year they come out with a report card. They give a grade, a percentage grade, 0 to 100, to the legislators, and every year around January, she'll text me and say, "You got an 8% again. You're under 10." Source of embarrassment for her. And so I think it's that sort of, for me, I don't have the perspective that Chad has of coming from local government. I do. I mean, I come from the district I represent, Southeast Los Angeles County, 9 cities, economically tough areas. Again, I said 8 of the 9 cities have poverty rates of 20% or more. We have governance issues where 5 of the 9 cities have former council members in prison right now. So there's very significant crises in those districts. And I think to a large extent, what we can do and should do better is to make sure that those local governments have the resources they need. Again, I'm going to agree with Chad, and I think the analogy for cap and trade needs to be local control funding. I think the need should go, I think the funds should go where the need is greatest. We've done that through LCFF, and I want to make sure that we do that this year with respect to cap and trade. And I also think what's one of the things that we haven't touched on much is within the context of 12-year term limit extensions, we have this opportunity to do way more oversight than we used to. Oversight isn't all that sexy to sort of call in a department head and to ask them, what have you been doing the last few years? Isn't something that sort of garners headlines or necessarily gets you elected to the next office. So I think, again, in that short 6-year term limited era, there wasn't a lot of that. I chaired the Utilities and Commerce Committee 2 years ago, and I called in the PUC president. It was the first time in 3 years he'd been called in to report to the legislature. So I think a lot of that was missing. And I think those types of things, which help to sort of build trust in government, in California government, also I think trickle down to the local government and have an impact. And what's interesting about government in general, you talked about the Janet Nguyen incident that happened in the state Senate. A lot of people don't make distinctions, right? I came home that week and people said, like, what happened on your floor? And I was like, that's not us. A lot of people don't make distinctions between the Assembly, the Senate, between even different layers of government. When you're working hard, you're working sometimes 2 jobs and you're raising kids. If your trash doesn't get picked up, you don't know who to yell at, but it's the government's fault, right? So I think to the extent that we have our house in order, I think that's better. I think that's better for everyone.
So final question we have here is to go from the local all the way to DC. You mentioned this a little bit, Chad, in terms of the kind of access you might have, especially with McCarthy in leadership. But why can't the California delegation seem to get its act together, right? Why is it our state legislators that have to come together to say, what can we do on something like healthcare to make sure that our state isn't negatively impacted, at least too much? Like, why doesn't our California delegation get along the way you guys are getting along?
Yeah, I'm trying to think of giving it short because I know I've been talking a lot this evening. So there are certain types of people that run for elected office. Jay Leno had a line, said that politics is show business for ugly people. Present company excluded. Present company excluded. But there are an awful lot of people who run for political office because they want to be in show business. They get elected to Congress. And it's a fascinating thing that happens where we're at today is that those who are getting the headlines are the biggest provocateurs on TV. And it shows an individual's character when they go out and do that sort of thing. But for some reason, the media love it. For some reason, on Facebook, people love it. So if you are a hardcore a progressive, or if you're a hardcore conservative, if you say the most crazy thing about the other side, that's what gets picked up and what gets distributed. If you say the most crazy thing on the other side, that's what gets picked up on nightly news. And I think, unfortunately, it shows our collective character of where we're at now. And that's what bothers me a little bit, which is why I believe so strongly that leaders need to begin to step up and start acting in a responsible, adult-like fashion and begin to be civil and have civil debate. I'm absolutely convinced of that.
I've heard that Jay Leno quote before, that politics is show business for ugly people. I think politics is sports for people with no physical talent at all. It's this sort of it's very competitive, and there's winners and losers, and but none of us can jump or dive or any of those types of things or run. And I think Chad is right. I mean, there's this focus on. There's always seems to be this focus on winning, and there always seems to be this focus on in politics on headlines, on splash, on whether or not you're on the front page. And the reality is, politics it's not sports. It's if you're doing it right, it's slow, it's tedious, it's at times mundane and a bit dull. You're in your office late at night. I was talking to a police officer once, and I asked, "What's the cop show that's most like what it's like to be a police officer?" And he said, "There's nothing, because it would be mostly sitting in an office filling out reports, right?" I don't know if that's true or not, but to a large, so much of what you see on TV, I don't watch the show, the Kevin Spacey show. Yeah. Still waiting for somebody to be killed in the Capitol, right? I haven't seen that, and there's this idea that there's all these backroom deals and this and that, and it's not that exciting on that level. It's exciting at the end and when you get something done and when you get something accomplished, but it's a really slow, tedious process. And if you're doing it right, then that's how it's done. And I think, just as Chad said, people are trying to make headlines. I think that very much plays into it.
Well, I'll say there's one recent headline which I think offers some ray of hope. I totally didn't coordinate this, but as you mentioned it. So there's another bipartisan bromance. I don't know if you guys know about this. So on NPR, so with the snowstorm in D.C., it says, bipartisan bromance blossoms as 2 Texas congressmen make D.C. road trip. So they missed their flights. They had to go. So they did a road trip. But this is where entertainment could be a force for good, right? Because they used this hashtag, Congressional Cannonball Run, right? And people were sending them questions. And I think they had some live streaming of things that they did, but they basically did this buddy road trip, kind of like what you guys do when you get together for beers and other things. And it seems like it could make a difference. And I think there's a real hunger. Assemblymember Lowe recently wrote an op-ed with someone from Dr. Barry Corey from Biola University to show that just because you disagree, you don't need to be disagreeable, but also you can get to know each other over time and actually build some basis of understanding to figure out what you can move forward on. So I think there's a real hunger for that now, maybe seeing the kind of excesses that we've seen in recent years, and so hopefully that's a turning point. Few questions here that I have. If people have others, please send them up. So we have the student ambassadors here who will pick up any additional cards that you have. So one question for both of you: what are the approaches to help young entrepreneurs, and why are they so different? I don't know if they're different. So do you guys have policies on young entrepreneurs, and are they different?
Are young entrepreneurs different from?
No, do Republicans and Democrats have different policies on?
I don't know what the Republican caucus is doing. We recently, actually, I think it may be bipartisan. We have a millennial caucus. Is that? So we have a millennial caucus that we've kicked off in the legislature or just the assembly. I'm not sure. Which is trying to focus, obviously, on younger, from my perspective, younger folks, and to sort of talk about a lot of the issues that impact them. And particularly, there's a particular focus, and you mentioned Evan Lowe a little earlier, who represents the Silicon Valley, and I know certainly that's his charge. There's also a tech caucus as well that wants to make sure that we focus on tech and tech jobs in general. And if you think about the expand or where the California economy has expanded in the past 15, 20, 25 years, it's all been in those tech areas. So I think those are important measures that we've taken.
I'm a Republican, so I love entrepreneurs. I could say more about it.
Yeah, no, we'll catch Chad at the We don't have any alcoholic drinks today, but catch that at the non-alcoholic bar at the back today. Okay, another question is about blue-collar jobs and environmental protection, right? So is there an inherent conflict between providing blue-collar jobs to more people versus environmental protection? Where would you stand on that?
I think we should probably both answer this question, maybe. That's one of the things I struggle with a lot because I was just talking to somebody with county government earlier, and they were talking about in Riverside County how the unemployment rate has shrunk. But if you dig a little bit deeper, you will find out that the jobs that we have today are paying significantly less than what they once did. And we were talking about that half of the population here in the Inland Empire has not gotten a college degree. These are people who are working, who have kids, who have families, who have mortgages, who have car payments. They've got to make a living as well. And at one point in time in California, California was the place where those jobs wanted to be. And it seems as though those good-paying, working-class, union-level paying jobs are fleeing California. So if you are in the tech sector, if you've up in the Silicon Valley or you're in the life sciences and you're down in San Diego, you're doing really well in California. But for a lot of folks who don't have the education, they're not doing real well. Well, why is that? Why are those jobs leaving? Well, it is our tax and regulatory environment. And so we've got to be thinking in regards to every decision that every new bill or every new law that we have, we should understand in a comprehensive way what impact that is going to have upon the people of California. And I do believe over the last 15, 20 years, there are some things that we've passed that have had a negative impact on those blue-collar jobs. Everybody wants clean air, and we should demand clean air. Everybody wants clean water. We should demand clean water. But we should also make sure that when we make the decisions that we're making, that we also make sure that we're not running jobs out of the state at the same time.
With respect to the environment and jobs and blue-collar jobs, the renewable energy sector now employs more people than the big three IOUs, than Southern California Edison, PG&E, and San Diego Gas and Electric. So I think that's really is the nexus. If you look at my district, which is again Southeast Los Angeles County, I have a buddy who termed out of the Michigan Legislature a couple of years ago and moved to LA, and I was driving him through my district once, and he said it reminds him a lot of Detroit, a lot of closed factories and a lot of closed factories and warehouses, and I think for us there's this ability to kind of make sure that while those jobs in renewables while they have been developing, that they're developing everywhere and that they're developing throughout the state. In Sacramento, and I think throughout the state, the great divide that exists now is not between North and South, but really between East and West. If you look at economic development, it's all along the coast. If you look at where economic development is not happening or where there are significant challenges, including here in the Inland Empire and the Central Valley, significant poverty in the Central Valley, we really need to make sure that there's a sort of an equitable distribution of I'm starting to get very socialistic for Chad. He's getting nervous here. We have to make sure that the jobs are everywhere and that the job growth is everywhere. And I think what's really important, as a UCR grad, what was exciting for me and Mr. Medina was the author of this bill. My very first vote on the floor of the Assembly as a member of the Assembly was on the UC Riverside Medical School, which Mr. Medina was. And we need to make sure we do the same thing at Merced. And we need to make sure that there's up and down the spine of the state, the sort of heart of the state, that we're continuing to do that. And I think that's why this university is so important. That's why Cal State San Bernardino is so important. That's why University of Pacific is so important. That's why UC Merced is so important, because we've seen where jobs develop. There's no mystery why Silicon Valley developed around Stanford and other areas of higher education. There's no mystery why the research triangle exists in Chapel Hill, Raleigh. There's a bunch of universities there. If you look at Boston, there's a great high-tech field booming there on the Cambridge side of the river, where MIT and Harvard are. That's not a coincidence. That's very real. So this university and the universities in these areas are, I think, exceptionally important towards making sure that not only that we continue to develop jobs out of the green economy, but they exist throughout the state.
Okay, we're going to go to a little bit of speed round in a sentence, if you can. I don't know if you can, but let's just go through some of these. Marijuana policy. Is there any common ground on this between Republicans and Democrats?
Oh, there's common ground on this. It's now the law in California, so we've got to figure it out.
It's now the law in California. We need to figure it out. Okay. I was in favor of legalization before it happened, and I'm glad it did. We do know from what we learned in Colorado was that after legalization happened, there have been a billion cleanup bills and efforts. So we can't just pass the proposition and sort of let things take their own course. We need to really keep our eye on the ball.
Okay, next question is, I think, maybe not specifically focusing on indivisible, but all these town halls that are erupting. Some members of Congress are trying to avoid it. Any thoughts on that?
I think I keep going back to talking about my district, and when I first got elected in a district of 500,000 people, 500,000 people, I finished in first place with 8,300 votes. 8,300 people checked my name out of 500,000 people, and I'm supposed to be happy about that, right? Yay, I won. Democracy is something that we need to make sure is vital, and I think these efforts and others, I think, as we want to be civil, and we should, but I think these sorts of organic outspurts of democracy are a good thing.
Anytime people are going to be active in the public square, they should be, but don't just show up to town halls. It's pretty disturbing that in LA County, when they had their votes just last week, only 12% turnout. So not so good. If you're going to go to a town hall, you should probably turn out to vote.
Yeah. I'll make a plug for a recent report that we did with the Advancement Project called Unequal Voices. So it's not just about voting, but even showing up to meetings, contacting elected officials. Not only is it low, there's very strong racial disparities. And even if you go into the millennial generation, very strong racial disparities. So we've got a lot of work to do. I think I'll just end with one question. There's still a lot more, but we need to save time for the reception. So I guess I'll just ask a maybe modified version of this. This asked in a college setting, but more broadly, I think we can return to this theme. So with the kind of tense political period that we're in, what might be the most effective way to communicate ideological differences to still kind of keep the eye on the prize of problem solving the way that you've talked about today?
I think, and again, because we don't have much time and I want to pontificate for a little bit, but it's important to actually sit and listen. Just listen. Don't talk over somebody like you're right. Shows a little bit of humility and just listen. Dr. Barry Corey from Biola, he wrote a book called Love Kindness. If you have a chance to read it, go read that book. It's Love Kindness. It's fantastic. And there's this one term that he uses in that book, firm center, soft edges. Know who you are, believe what you're going to believe, but have soft edges when you're responding to others. Sit down, have conversations, and try to work towards a consensus. And just one last thing, because where we're at in this country today is at one point in time there were 3 news stations, right? So NBC, ABC, CBS. Now it seems as though if you're a conservative, you only watch Fox News. If you're a liberal, you only watch MSNBC. If you are a liberal, you read the Huffington Post. And if you are a Republican or if you're a conservative, you might read the Washington Times or Breitbart or something else. And so we've tended to get ourselves in a place where we're only listening to those of us in our own echo chamber. Step out of your own echo chamber. Know who you are, know what you believe, but at the same time, listen to others on the other side.
This is another area where Chad and I are going to say the same thing. We have, I think, 10 freshman Democrats in this assembly class. Sabrina Cervantes was here earlier. She's part of that class. And I had lunch with them about a month ago, and somebody asked me, what's the one skill I need to be an effective legislator? And I said, listen, I authored the water bond 3 years ago now, I think. And what we did there, again, given the corruption and lack of accountability and in my district, I thought that the way I wanted to do the water bond was to kind of travel throughout the state and listen to people. We did 18 public hearings throughout the state, from Coachella in the south to, I think we went up as far north as Eureka. And I remember one day, started around 3 p.m., we were in Hanford in northern Kern County, and the hearing started around 3 p.m. and it starting to end around 5:30 p.m. And that's when a lot of folks in California back then, and probably still now, we have, if you add up all the land that's fallow because of the drought, it's larger than the state of Rhode Island. I mean, it's that much. That's how significant the drought has been. And around 5:30, 6 p.m., the audience was about 2/3 full, and then all of a sudden we started seeing the audience was filling up, right when the auditorium was filling up, right when we were about ready to go home. And that's when the food banks close. People stand in line all day to get cans of food, and then these people who are suffering wanted to come and engage in, and to talk about how important water is in their lives. And I think we stayed until Rudy Salas, who represents Bakersfield in the assembly, he and I stayed till 8:30, 9 o'clock that night, because we wanted everybody to go up to the microphone and talk. And we sat there for 4 or 5 hours. We didn't say a word. We just listened, because really it's their story. It's their story about the drought. It's their story about the effect that water had on their lives that we needed to hear. And I'll tell one last story, because I know we got to go. But I think another thing, I've said this before, like all politicians, I have a bit of an ego, right? And I spoke at the Women's March in downtown LA. I didn't see you. There were a lot of people there.
Actually, I was in Washington.
He was he was. Yeah. The other one.
Trying to get around.
I spoke at the Women's March in LA, and there were a lot of people, and I gave this speech, and then I was feeling pretty good. I thought I gave a pretty good speech. My mom and wife was like, "Yeah, honey, you did well." And then I go home, and I represent the city of Southgate. It's one of the 9 cities that I represent. I go home, and I flip on the news, and this 8-year-old girl from Southgate, one of my constituents, spoke at the Women's March in D.C. And part of me thought, wow, she's amazing. The other part of me thought, oh man, she's way better than my speech. my speech was lousy. And I think it's this, I think if you're doing this job right, you're listening, and there's this sense of humility that no matter what we say, it's always going to be secondary to the people that we represent. No matter what we say, there's always going to be this degree of abstraction that we can't quite match when it's coming from the people that you represent. So if we listen, I think we can hear those voices and be better at our jobs.
Wow. Well, thank you both. This is great, and we've been live streaming it. I think we're going to at least take parts of it. It's been a great, wide-ranging conversation. Please join us for the reception in the back. I'm sure a lot of folks from here would like to talk to you. But thank you again for being here. Thank you again for the Center for California Studies for inviting us to host this.